joining us for this webinar on expectation for SB64. My name is Pascale Bird, and I'm the Executive Director of Legal Response International. And I am joined here by my colleagues at LRI, Monserrat, Madariaga, Mara, Wendebourg, Harrison Cox, and I have also the pleasure to be joined by Dr. Alice Venn, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol, specializing in climate law and policy, loss and damage, climate justice, just transition, amongst other topics, and by Elizabeth Hoyle, who is a senior associate at Ashurst law firm, and has volunteered with us, and also has been seconded to our organization, was seconded to our organization last year. So we will talk about a number of topics today, covering really those key topics that are expected to be on the agendas at SB64. So we're not going to have time in this short session to cover them all, but we'll address briefly at least the most important one. But before we dive into the topics themselves, I think it might be useful perhaps to use as a starting point and slightly wind back the clock to where things were left last year at the end of COP30, which took place in Belém. And for those of you who attended the negotiations, you no doubt will remember that the closing plenary was the stage of a high drama. And I want to start off by talking about this briefly because it illustrates some of the really imperfections and tricky issues which arise in a process which is extremely complex, which is an intergovernmental process covering pretty much all the countries in the world, and most importantly, where decisions are taken by consensus. So very briefly, at the closing plenary, which took place, which had overrun. So this was on the Saturday at the end of the 2-week period, which was supposed to finish on the Friday. The president, Correa, the Brazilian president of the COP, Mr. Correa de Lago, who was the president of the COP and so officiating, started off by adopted some decision as a package, which was referred to as the Belém political package. In so doing, he was departing from the usual practice, which is of adopting decisions that have been submitted for adoption by the COP or the CMA or the CMP individually. So normally the process is for him to explicitly mention the decision to be adopted, and then scan the room. And if no one objects, if no one is raising a flag, and then no one is, he then scanned the gavel, and at that point the decision is, and says, hearing no objection, this decision is adopted. He departed from that by effectively adopting listing a series of decisions, all of them forming what's referred to as the Belém political package, which included quite a number of important decisions, including on the global goal on adaptation and on mitigation, the mitigation work program, and some others, to adopt them in one go. So this was important insofar as I say, it's a departure from usual practice. in some ways, because he's the president and he has control over the proceedings, he was entitled to do that. However, he's also ultimately under the authority of the COP, which is effectively the made up of all the parties to the conference, and this decision to do so was very heavily criticized because he ignored, seemingly, the fact that some parties had raised their hands and raised their flag and indicated points of order, as you can see on the photos here, and these were not, and under the rules of procedure, when a point of order is being raised, the president has to stop and immediately address it. And he didn't do that. He didn't do this. And as I say, he proceeded with listing all the decision, and then quickly looked through the room and then adopted them all. And at that point gave the floor to parties, and parties then at that point raised their concern about the procedure, the way this had been happening. Then there was, because of the concerns being raised, he suspended the proceeding, talked to people in the secretariat, etc., and then came back and ultimately said that actually the decision had been adopted and they are staying adopted. But noted the concern, apologized for the fact that he had not seen that the flags had been raised, and also try to alleviate concern raised by parties by saying that their concern would be mentioned in the report of the session. However, this, as I said, underline some of the imperfection, as I said, of the process, because ultimately this has the potential of undermining trust, transparency, and also procedural fairness, and is therefore not ideal, as I say, but is a result to a very large extent of the fact that decisions are taken by consensus rather than by a vote. And at this point, I will pass on the floor to my colleague Monse, who will briefly talk about some reforms we are in the offing to try and address some of these imperfections in the process. Monse?
Thank you. Thank you, Pascale. So as Pascale was saying, and giving the example of the closing plenary at COP30, that's just one more example of things going a bit wrong in the conduct of the negotiations. So as a consequence of that, and because also perhaps, the COP has not been delivering the results that most parties and stakeholders hope it would be delivering, there's been increasing discussions around how to reform the COP process and to make it work a bit better for everyone. And so when we talk about COP reform, is this sort of umbrella concept that encompasses all sorts of ideas around the negotiation sessions, not just the COP, of course, also the SBs, meetings, etc., and how to make them better. For example, how the logistics of the negotiation sessions could work best, maybe having a smaller COPs, or centralizing in some countries. Also how to increase the efficiency of the process by streamlining the agendas, because of course the agendas have multiplied a lot. There's also discussion about reform the decision-making process, which now is consensus-based, which of course makes it more difficult to reach agreement, and this is because the rules of procedure have not been approved, especially the voting rule. There are issues and concerns always about inclusivity and transparency in the negotiations, not just who goes to the COPs and, you know, the different sizes in delegations, but also how towards the end of the session, there are so many meetings where some sit and others don't. And so that has also, there are ideas around to improve that. There are a lot of recent questioning around how the co-presidencies exercise their power. The example that Pascale just gave is very testimonial of that. So, you know, regulating a bit more, clarifying a bit more the co-presidency's limits, that's also under COP reform. And then, of course, all sorts of discussions around approving and perhaps modifying some of the draft rules of procedures that we use. These ideas are talked about outside of the negotiations through papers, you know, academia, press, etc. You can find loads of input, but they're also addressed, or at least some of them, in the negotiation process. And this is why I wanted to flag this now, because actually these discussions are richer traditionally, and they only happen in Bonn. They did happen in the COP, probably because the host of the session had not been yet decided for COP 31. But they're definitely, you know, stronger, longer, and more detailed during the Bonn session. And they happen under this negotiation stream that is called Arrangement for Intergovernmental Meetings, or AIM. And the sort of things that are discussed there, especially in the last 3 sessions, are increasing the efficiency of the UNFCCC process, including through streamlining the agendas, but not exclusively through that. Maybe strengthening the role of the Bureau and the representation of parties in the Bureau to make it more inclusive. There's been discussion about downsizing COP and potentially capping the size of delegations to 200 or 500 delegates, which of course is a lot, but still some delegations have thousands of delegates for each COP. And that's, of course, stresses the services that are around the COP, the transport, the hotels, and making it more difficult for delegates to participate. There's been mandates to increase the capacity building of delegates, especially on procedural issues or even legal issues. And then in this room also, there's a lot of discussion around what we call now the action agenda, or the non-negotiated outcomes, the presidential events, the roadmaps, and what relationship would this have with the COP. So all of these things are perhaps, you know, maybe some of your delegations or groups are not putting a lot of attention to this, but they're cross-cutting. They have an impact on mitigation, on all sorts of negotiation streams, especially when there are a lot of work programs or mandated events. And therefore, I just wanted to sort of raise that these negotiations happen in case your delegations are not represented there, or that you're not too aware of those discussions, because they definitely have an impact on your negotiation streams as well. And from my experience following these negotiations in the last 3 sessions, I would say that the representation in the room is not very even. There's a lot of countries and groups that are underrepresented in that room. So just, you know, letting you know and inviting you to familiarize yourself with this issue. And now we move to the thematic areas and to the first one, which would be just transition. And we wanted to start with this one because, as I always say, I think that the only negotiators that came out all smiles from the COP30 were the negotiators on just transition, or at least the happier ones. Maybe not super happy, but definitely happier. And let's, of course, acknowledge what a moment these negotiations had after 2 years of having no outcome, of being a bit complicated. And so yeah, congratulations to the negotiators on just transition. So for those of you that are not following just transition comes in the negotiations, maybe not from the beginning of the convention, but 2010 onwards. And even in the negotiations and even outside of the negotiations, it has diverging concepts that actually make it perhaps a bit more problematic to reach agreement on just transition in the negotiation. So when it emerged as a concept in this space, it emerged as very much linked with workforce. So basically how the cost of the transition shouldn't be paid by workers. And then we think about miners, car companies, etc. And very much, around workers. So this concept is very much still the dominant concept, especially in global North countries, but it has evolved systematically to include other aspects of the just transition, especially the impact of transition projects, perhaps, or green projects in the communities that are going to take those projects, the impact of extracting materials that are necessary for the transition, extracting minerals, new minerals, and the impact on communities where these are. And also the ecosystems, of course, including expanding the concept to protecting the ecosystems as well as we move into transition. And so this broader approach is more present in developing countries. Of course, the reason is very practical. The location of the extraction tends to be in developing countries, whilst the sort of closing down of factories or coal industry, etc., tends to happen where it already is, which is in developed countries. That's a bit simplistic approach, but roughly that's how the concepts are divided. So as I was saying, this transition has not been in the negotiations from ever, but only from 2010 onwards. And between 2010 and 2014, we see a very limited engagement of just transition in the negotiations. There are some recognitions, especially in the negotiation stream that relates to response measures, which is much older. But yeah, this recognition starts increasing in dialogues, etc., messages from the COP, until in 2015, when in the Paris Agreement, there's an inclusion on just transition on the Paris Agreement, but it's a preambular inclusion. It's not a provision. At the same time, just transition is included as one of the two main priorities of a work program on response measures. Then, there's more progress. One highlight would be the COP24, which was in Poland. And I don't know if you remember, but it was in Katowice, which is a coal mining town. So there were lots of miners there represented. And so it was, and the presidency very much wanted to promote the idea of just transition and the transition not being paid by the workers. And so there was this declaration, this Silesia Declaration, which was signed by many, many countries, committing themselves to respect just transition, but also committing some sort of support. It would be only in COP21 where the governing bodies, and I mean the COP and the CMA, recognize, there's a formal declaration where they recognize the need to promote just transition and accompanied by the need to support developing countries, means of implementation, broadly speaking. Then the following COP27 in Egypt, they decided to establish the Just Transition Work Program, but of course it's only one paragraph. So COP23 operationalized the Just Transition Work Program, which basically consists of 2 dialogues per year. And as these dialogues were happening, there were negotiations on the Just Transition Work Program as well, that, as I said, struggled a lot to make a decision to even reference what had happened in the dialogues, right? many things happen to make these negotiations more difficult, including that in the last SB session, the agenda item on trade measures was decided to be addressed in these negotiations. So for a minute, it seemed like that was going to compromise the little progress. The causes for this little progress were, amongst others, that because the definition of just transition was so divergent, countries didn't want to move forward on thinking about the future or committing on a future to institutionalize the just transition work program, for example, if this scope was not clear. But finally, COP30, we have a very comprehensive decision where parties first recognized some key messages emerging from the dialogues, loads of messages there on indigenous peoples, very strong messages on indigenous peoples. So I invite you to review them if you haven't. And also they agreed to institutionalize just transition through a just transition mechanism. Of course, they decide to develop it. So it will be for the next COP to actually develop this mechanism. And so this is what we're going to be looking at in terms of negotiations when we go to Bonn. Yeah, just a very quick, this is maybe for you to see it in detail later, but a very brief recap of what has been the work program and what is going to be decided in relation to the mechanism. So as I said, the work program is operationalized through dialogues. There we have the 5 thematic dialogues that have happened so far. And as I say, the last COP recognized 22 key messages from the first dialogues because the 5th one only happened this year. And COP also decided to develop, instead of establish or adopt, right? It decided to develop the just transition mechanism. So it will be for the SBs to work on a draft decision and then CMA 8 to actually establish or adopt the mechanism on the basis of the discussions that will happen in Bonn. What sort of things are we hoping to discuss in Bonn? And you should be ready for this type of discussions. And we know this also because there are already submissions on the issue. First, a bit like what is the just transition mechanism going to cover? The approach, is it going, and also that also applies to the scope or the definition of just transition. But is it going to be a capacity building exercise, facilitation between countries? Is it going to have anything on means of implementation? So all of that. A big question is the just transition mechanism going to replace the just transition work program, or when parties review the just transition work program, are they going to extend it? And these are going to be 2 separate things. A third issue is what the role of experts is going to be in these institutions. Is there going to be an experts body, maybe like in the WIM, or are we just going to have parties in the new institution? And then, of course, some thematic priorities are expected to be included. As I say, recently, indigenous peoples has been taking prominence, but also critical minerals, human rights, amongst others. So I'll stop here with just transition. If you have any questions on this, maybe place them on the chat, and as we move forward, we'll try to address them towards the end. I pass to Harrison, who's going to do mitigation.
Thank you, Monse. Mitigation is a big topic in the negotiations. It's one that is covered throughout the UNFCCC, throughout the Paris Agreement. It's at the heart of both treaties as well as the Kyoto Protocol. Ultimately, mitigation is about efforts to reduce emissions as well as to enhance sinks. It kind of has two key aspects. This comes from the recognition that it's one of the keys to solving the climate change problem is to reach a global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. By reaching this peak, we will then reach a balance between through through a balance in emissions and removals, we would reach this peak. And that is because there's been a scientific recognition that there's a relationship between the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere and global average temperatures. So as I said, there's two main aspects to mitigation, the first being efforts to reduce emissions. This is really quite varied. It can include anything from promoting renewable energies to approaches to circular economy, whereas enhancing sinks is more referring to topics about increasing forest cover or ocean mangroves cover. Mitigation in the negotiations, as I said, is at the core of the agreements. And that really implies that it's in lots of different topics. So you can find, of course, mitigation in NDCs, but also in the global stocktake, in carbon market discussions, compliance discussions, as well as response measures. I'm just going to be talking about NDCs today, as well as the mitigation work program, which is looking at mitigation in the negotiations. So NDCs, as many of you will know, so I will go through this quite quickly, is kind of the core obligation in the, or at least the core procedural obligation in the Paris Agreement, where parties agreed to maintain and update mitigation objectives through nationally determined contributions. So the parties submit every 5 years a new NDC. This NDC contains a 10-year perspective on their kind of projected emissions and what they're hoping their objectives in terms of emissions reductions. So they embody efforts by each country to reduce national emissions, and they increasingly include elements on adaptation, loss and damage, other topics beyond reducing emissions. They become quite cross-cutting, and this is really a reflection of how interlinked all of the aspects of the Paris Agreement are. The NDCs are a procedural obligation. At heart, the procedural obligation is to prepare, communicate, and maintain successive NDCs. But as was recently highlighted by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion, they're also an obligation of results as part of the due diligence standard to be adequate and represent the highest level of ambition. Still, this doesn't necessarily mean at the international level, at least, that there can be sanctions if a country doesn't follow its NDC, doesn't follow through, because the compliance and accountability mechanisms created by the Paris Agreement are only able to examine procedural aspects of NDCs. So essentially, does each country maintain and communicate new NDCs? It's the compliance mechanism isn't looking at the level of ambition in each NDC. However, at the national level or regional level, there can be litigation against states relating to their commitments in their NDCs. NDCs, why are we talking about NDCs now? Because last year was an important year for NDCs with the latest round. So as I mentioned, they're submitted every 5 years with a 10-year perspective. Last year, the third generation of NDCs were set to be submitted. They were supposed to be submitted by February last year. Only 13 states met that deadline. That deadline was extended to September. Again, only quite a few more states had submitted by then, around 60. However, that only represented around 30% of global emissions. Why is it a problem that these states didn't submit by the deadline? The Secretariat of the UNFCCC was preparing a report to inform discussions at COP30 on progress, or at least on the NDCs. And it meant that report, and so essentially what parties were able to base their discussions on, only contained references to 30% of global emissions. Still, the report is quite interesting when looking at it. Notably, it indicated that all parties that had submitted their NDCs by the deadline included updated information on mitigation targets, as well as an increase in quality and economic coverage of these NDCs. It also highlighted that every single NDC that had been submitted included elements beyond mitigation on topics such as adaptation, finance, technology transfer, loss and damage, as well as many other topics. At COP30, the NDC synthesis report was not actually discussed by parties in a dedicated agenda item. It was, however, discussed briefly in the presidential consultations, which the COP30 presidency led, which ultimately led to the global Monserrat decision, which Pascale mentioned at the beginning. Still, even if this could be considered a success in a way, the global Monserrat decision only references challenges, gaps, and barriers to implementation of climate action, and it doesn't actually engage with any of the report's findings. And this is really mostly because parties are quite reluctant to engage on anything that's touching on mitigation, because they fear that this could undermine the nationally determined nature of NDCs. At COP30, there was still a global implementation accelerator that was launched as a voluntary and cooperative facilitative space for interested parties to work towards the 1.5 degrees goal. It also includes other efforts on adaptation, which I believe Pascale will be talking about later on. This synthesis report is not going to be discussed at SB64, or at least it's not on the agenda. Still, there will be some discussion of NDCs, as 37 parties will be undergoing the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress, which reviews and allows an open dialogue on individuals' countries' NDCs. Just a quick note on the mitigation work programme, because I think I am out of time. The mitigation work programme was created or was established to urgently enhance mitigation, ambition and implementation, really as a complement to the global stocktake. This was back in 2021 at the Glasgow COP. The idea was that it would be facilitative, non-prescriptive, and respect national sovereignty and circumstances, and it would not impose new targets. The mitigation work programme has had really quite difficult negotiations in the last few years. There's been very little progress essentially since it was established, and this is mostly due to questions around how to integrate the role of the global stocktake in the mitigation work programme. COP30 was quite important for the mitigation work programme because it was set to start discussions on the future of the mitigation work programme, which is set to come or to be reviewed this year at COP31. Still, again, there was very few discussions, or they weren't very fruitful. It was also the only place mitigation was being discussed, and again, parties were opposed to discussing it. So SB64 becomes quite an important setting for this, as it's the final conference before the review of the mitigation work programme. Parties have made submissions on this and opportunities and best practices linked to the future continuation and implementation of the work programme. And there will also be discussions on the global dialogues which happen under this mitigation work programme. I will now pass on to Elizabeth for the global stocktake.
Thanks very much, Harrison. So global stocktake, I'll run through this quickly, just as a sort of quick overview for those who might not be so familiar, though I'm sure most of you are. So the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement runs in 5-year cycles and allows parties and non-party stakeholders to come together and assess the collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the Paris Agreement and its long-term goals. So it runs alongside and slightly staggered from the NDC cycles. So what negotiators have seen over the previous 8 months prior to COP30 is very slow and protracted negotiations with no decisions coming out until the closing plenary at COP30. The final decision that was gabbled through at the closing plenary addressed all 3 elements that were on the CMA agenda. So that's the United Arab Emirates dialogue on implementing the global stocktake outcomes. So this is the modalities of how the UAE dialogue will occur and what form it will take. There was also decisions on reports from the 2024 and 2025 annual GST dialogues, which will continue, and also decisions on the procedural and logistical elements of the overall global stocktake process. So on the UAE dialogue, parties finally reached agreement on the modalities and format after, like I said, very protracted negotiations. The first UAE dialogue session will be held at SB64 this upcoming month. Crucially, outputs from the UAE dialogue are decided to be in the form of reports, which will feed into the GST2 input cycle, concluding in 2028. However, the outcome was very specific that these output reports are to be explicitly facilitative and non-prescriptive. This sort of highlights the tension that's been in GST negotiations for a while now between parties looking for a bridge between GST1 and GST2 to drive mitigation, adaptation, ambition, and those insisting that the GST is not a top-down process that's going to impose any kind of direction on the nationally determined nature of NDCs. So the UAE dialogue will happen at SB64. There'll be another one at SB66, and a high-level ministerial roundtable will convene at COP32 to hear the outcomes of those UAE dialogues. The annual GST dialogue will also continue. This is meant to be a sort of informal space for parties to gather and discuss how any GST outcomes can help with the preparation and submission of future NDCs. On the logistical and procedural elements, the decision sort of captures, again, some points of contention that have been happening in the GST negotiations. So the first important one to look out for, which will continue to be relevant at SB64, is the tension between the IPCC cycle and the GST cycle. So the scientific inputs from the IPCC have been prioritized to date as a GST input. There's debate between developed and developing countries as to whether the GST cycle should be adapted to allow for IPCC input. The eventual COP30 decision only encouraged the scientific community to provide timely inputs as available and declined to amend the GST timetable to match with the IPCC. Again, we saw LMDC and Arab groups questioning the IPCC's status. This is interesting as to whether these are sort of scientific discussions or whether it's developed versus developing country primacy discussions, but they did make for some interesting negotiations at COP30. A final thing to point out is that loss and damage was included as a standalone thematic area for GST2. I know Alice is going to talk more about loss and damage later, but this was a really significant outcome, especially for LDC and ILAC blocks who were campaigning for specific mention of loss and damage within the GST. So just to look forward to SB64, a bit of a recap of what I've just said. The first UAE dialogue on implementing the GST outcomes will take place. Parties and non-party stakeholders have been invited to submit their input between COP30 and now. The annual GST dialogue, very confusingly similarly named, will be facilitating the sharing of knowledge and good practices in that more informal space. And there'll be continued technical work on those GST input modalities. So as I said, the interaction between scientific input, the global balance of scientific input, and as always, more discussion on the tension between directions coming down from the GST process and the individual parties and their control over their own NDCs. I'm not sure who I'm passing on to.
I think it might be to me.
The adaptation.
Yes.
Fab, I'll pass over to Pascale.
Thank you very much, Lizzie, for this. I hope you can see my slide properly. Yeah, okay, good. So I will briefly talk to you about now adaptation and key adaptation moment within the UNFCCC regime. So adaptation has been covered and negotiated really since the first days of this process, and is indeed covered under the convention, the UN Convention on Framework on Climate Change. However, the convention itself was quite mitigation-centric. And as a result of that, many countries, in particular developing countries for whom the impacts of climate change were particularly felt, and who need to make themselves more resilient and adapt to those impacts, pushed to ensure that the issue of adaptation would be treated on a par with mitigation. And so this was done in different stages. One of them was the adoption of the Cancun framework adaptation framework, which was adopted in 2010, and which whose aim was to accelerate action on adaptation, and which established the Adaptation Committee, which is the key body that provides technical support and guidance on adaptation issues. It also established the NAP process, NAP being the National Adaptation Plans that the parties prepare at a domestic level. It established this process. However, parties still kept the negotiation was still to a large extent dominated and focused on mitigation issues, and as a result of that, parties continued pushing for recognition of adaptation on a par with mitigation, and this was achieved largely through the Article 7 of the Paris Agreement that establishes a global goal on adaptation, which is intended to enhance adaptive capacity, reduce vulnerability, and strengthen resilience to the impact of climate changes. So that was in 2015, and then in addition to this, in 2021, a process was launched to develop a framework to track and measure progress on adaptation, because Article 7 is, well, it establishes a goal, but it is quite vague, and it is an aspirational goal, and it was recognized that if it needed to actually be practical and be measurable, it needed to be fleshed out. So this process has been done over the last few years, as I said, through, first of all, the establishment of this GLASS 2-year work program. Then that also led a few years later with the adoption of the UAE framework at COP27, which established thematic targets related to key areas such as water, food, health, ecosystem, etc., and dimensional targets, which are linked to the iterative adaptation cycle. It also, COP28 also launched a 2-year work program to develop indicators for tracking progress towards those targets, which was set to conclude in Belém. And so this now takes us back to Belém, and let me just move that, and to the negotiations there. So for the co-president, adaptation was going to be a priority, and he had clearly indicated that, as it is indeed a daily reality for many people in many countries. So the four top issues that were to be addressed: the operationalization of the GGA with the adoption of indicators, finalizing the assessment of progress in formulating and implementing national adaptation plans, or NAPs, clarification on how to close the adaptation finance gap, and then also advancing Baku adaptation roadmap to accelerate the GGA delivery through concrete steps. So the negotiations on the GGA were very fractious and tricky, but eventually parties did agree to a set of adaptation indicators, 59 adaptation indicators, and these were included in the GGA decision. However, as I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and if you remember, I mentioned the fact that this was adopted as part of the global package, and they were concerned by parties, and the concern were raised because the negotiation, as I said, were very fractious and carried on right to the end. And essentially, the list of indicators that was included in the text submitted for adoption was quite changed from the list that parties had been negotiating before and that experts had been working on. So there was a lot of concern and unhappiness about that. Many parties saying that these indicators were not usable as such. Some of them were not robust as such, etc. However, as I mentioned earlier, the decision was adopted and the adoption stood. The President tried to alleviate the concern by saying that actually the process is not finished, did not finish and complete in Belém, and that it will continue at SB 64. With parties continuing to refine these indicators and develop methodologies, metadata, etc., to make them effectively more usable. So, in addition to the adoption of indicators, the COP13 CMA7 established the Belém had his vision on adaptation, which is a 2-year policy alignment process, which is intended to help with effectively this the process of refining these indicators. It also invited parties to integrate these targets and indicator in relevant reporting and planning processes, including NAPs and reporting such as the BST that parties report under the transparency framework, etc. And also indicated that or clarified that the indicators would constitute a source of input to the GST. In relation to NAPs or National Adaptation Plans, these are very key instruments for parties to effectively spell out the medium and long-term plans on adapting to climate change and on integrating adaptation into key sectors of their economies. It's also really an important instrument for accessing climate finance and generally mobilizing international support. Those NAPs were due to be submitted as per the global stocktake in 2025. As of earlier this year, I think 76 countries so far have submitted their NAPs, and that illustrates some of the challenges faced by countries in formulating, let alone implementing their NAPs. And so the negotiation around on this topic are very much focusing on the challenges that countries are facing in relation to that, especially over what we call means of implementation, which refer to finance, technology, access to technology, development and transfer, and capacity building. And so negotiation had been really had not progressed for quite a number of years on this because of deep disagreement between parties on the recognition to be given to these means of implementation. However, there was also a strong push to actually come to a decision on this, and this happened in Belém with a decision adopted. However, the language used was quite weak, and so did not satisfy all parties. In relation to adaptation finance, the Madariaga decision reaffirm the doubling of adaptation finance that was agreed at CMA3 by 2025, but also by reference from 2019 level. But in addition to that, calls for efforts to at least triple adaptation finance by 2035. So there is a recognition there that there is a gap in finance that needs to be addressed. And however, there was also disappointment on the part of many parties, developing countries in particular, because of the pushing back the target to 2035 rather than 2030. There's no also clear baseline from which this measure of tripling will be figured out, and there was also no clear reference to Article 9.1 on provision of finance by developed countries to developing countries. There's also discussion around the adaptation fund and moving it to serve exclusively the Paris Agreement, some tricky discussion as well around the membership of the Adaptation Board, which are related to this move from the Kyoto Protocol to the CMA, and the transfer from the representation from potentially using Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 representation to developed and developing countries. And these were, and then the third issue that was discussed was the review of the adaptation fund. Parties were not able to resolve all these issues. They were to some extent hijacked by some countries, developed countries, saying that these needed to be agreed as a package, and other countries saying no, and they did not reach consensus. So the matter has been deferred to SB 64, and so looking ahead towards SB 64. Parties will continue with the technical process of developing and refining indicators, and this will include establishing a technical task force that will contribute to this process. A number of constituted bodies are also invited to take part, including the Adaptation Committee and the LEG. The indicators are then due to be reviewed after the second global Stocktake in 2029, and so the terms of reference for that review will be developed, will start to be developed at SB 64, and this will continue this year and next year. I haven't really talked about the bar, but I will leave it at that for now because I'm running out of time. Just very briefly to say that the two other agenda items that are due to be discussed in Bonn at the SB 64, one relates to the Adaptation Committee and the review of the progress, effectiveness and performance of the Adaptation Committee, and negotiations there have also been tricky, largely due to issues around the governance of the Adaptation Committee, whether it should be under the Convention or under the Paris Agreement or both. And then there will also be negotiations and discussion around the guidance on adaptation communication that parties would need to submit periodically under the Paris Agreement. And so this guidance has been developed, and there have been a process for effectively parties to provide information on how useful that guidance is. And this will, there were very few submissions, I understand, I think last year. So basically at this session, parties will continue, or the SBs will consider the timing for these further submission. In this synthesis report by the Secretariat based on these submissions, and then also more generally taking stock of the guidance set and whether it needs revising or not. And I will now pass on to Alice, who will talk to you about loss and damage.
Thank you very much, Pascale. So briefly, for those who might not be so familiar, loss and damage, this work stream relates to the inevitable loss and damage that will continue to occur and is occurring despite our best collective mitigation and adaptation efforts. And it encompasses both economic loss and non-economic loss. So things like cultural impacts, impacts on livelihoods and ecosystem services, as well as slow onset impacts such as sea level rise. And the infrastructure around it within the UNFCCC process dates back to 2013, when the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage was established at COP19, with the aims of facilitating and coordinating efforts to address and minimize loss and damage. And it has since been strengthened through the adoption of a loss and damage provision within the Paris Agreement in Article 8 in 2015, and through the subsequent expansion of the institutional framework around it with the Santiago Network at COP25 in 2019, which provides for the coordination of technical and capacity building support. And I will talk more about the fund shortly, but for the purposes of today, I'll just focus on some of the core discussions that came through in COP30 and some of the contentious and ongoing areas of work. So key areas of work at COP30 related to the fund for responding to loss and damage, and to the Warsaw International Mechanism, particularly the third review of the WIM. There were some pretty straightforward, non-contentious issues relating to the adoption of the joint annual reports of the WIM and the Santiago Network, which largely proceeded without issue. But then there was a lot more contention around the negotiations concerning the third review of the WIM and WIM governance, which has been an ongoing issue since the adoption of loss and damage into the Paris Agreement in 2015. And this relates to whether loss and damage should remain jointly governed by the COP and the CMA, or should transfer to the purview of the CMA exclusively. And there was no consensus on this issue. So to talk a bit more about the fund itself was established at COP27 and then operationalized at COP28 in 2023. So still relatively new. And as of the 15th of March, some $822 million has been pledged to the fund. It is dependent on voluntary pledges and aims to work with a range of stakeholders, not just states, and really to encourage bottom-up solutions and applications for direct resource to respond to loss and damage. So the key areas for debate at COP30 related to the adoption of the annual report of the board of the fund, and also to the launch of the Barbados implementation modalities, which comprise the first tranche of funding, which is being offered by the fund, and it's worth $250 million. Currently, bids are being invited from developing country parties over a 6-month period, which runs through to the 15th of June this year. Following that, the Secretariat of the fund will review those bids, and then following that, there will be a review of the BIM itself to look for any lessons learned, and also an assessment of whether a further allocation of funding is merited. The work plan of the board has been adopted for 2026 in this decision, the 7 linked here. And again, it refers to the need to review a further funding allocation. We've recently had the 8th meeting of the board, and discussions there have included the continuing operationalization of the BIM, along with the development of a long-term resource mobilization strategy. And this was something which proved to be a really core issue in the negotiations at COP30, the need for clearer steer on what that future replenishment of the fund will look like. With respect to the WIM and the third review, as I've mentioned, the WIM itself is really there to oversee, coordinate and facilitate action across a variety of loss and damage work areas, including economic and non-economic losses. The third review had been particularly contentious because it had been delayed owing to a lack of consensus for a decision at COP29 and also at the SBs that preceded COP30. So we were coming into the negotiations without a draft decision text. And these negotiations were quite protracted, and there was also a last-minute suspension and series of consultations and huddles in order to finally garner agreement on the decision. But nevertheless, there was significant step forward institutionally with the adoption of a new regular multi-year loss and damage report. And this report aims to synthesize information from both parties and stakeholders on issues, lessons learned, best practices, solutions and policy advice in the loss and damage space. There's a particular focus on community level initiatives, and it should also be based on the best available science, community input and Indigenous people's knowledge. Further contentious issues in these negotiations related to references to the first global stocktake outcome decision, which there was pushback on, and to references to the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change, which many delegations, including small island and developing states particularly, were pushing for in these negotiations. But that proved to be a red line in terms of the adoption of the decision. So we see finally no reference to the ICJ advisory opinion. In terms of next steps, so there is a focus on now hashing out the terms of reference for the new regular multi-year report. It's the responsibility of the Santiago Network Advisory Board, primarily in collaboration with the WIM Executive Committee, to put in place these terms of reference and then to bring them to the SBs. So that should be the next SB session after SB 64. And that's where we're going to see debate finally around what this is going to look like in practice, and then the modalities of this report. In terms of governance, as I say, there was no consensus reached at COP30 in relation to where wind governance should sit between the CMA or the COP or jointly. Some individual negotiating groups were able to reach consensus around joint governance, but overall consensus was not reached for a decision. There was quite limited time for this item. And in the end, the same text was adopted as we saw in previous decisions in CMA 6, which delays it to the 8th session in COP31. So looking ahead, discussions and work are ongoing within the operationalization of the BIM and the development of the future long-term resource mobilization strategy. There's also ongoing work around rapid disbursement modalities and small grants and direct access modalities for states to receive direct and rapid access to those funds. And in terms of ongoing issues, it's likely that the ICJ advisory opinion and the draft UN General Assembly resolution, which has been proposed by Vanuatu to acknowledge the ICJ advisory opinion, will continue to shape discussions in the loss and damage space. And certainly from some of the closing statements in the WIN review, there seems to be quite a determination to continue to push for the inclusion of these matters moving forwards. And although there are no standalone issues relating to loss and damage within the current SB64 draft agenda, it is a cross-cutting issue. So many of the themes relating to discussions of NDCs, to biennial transparency reports, both of which featured in the loss and damage negotiations discussions with respect to whether guidance should be put in place for the voluntary inclusion of loss and damage in both of those areas. Those discussions are likely to continue, and as well with respect to climate finance and the relationship between loss and damage funds work and the NCQG. But with that, I'll hand over to Mara to talk to you about finance. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much, Alice. And I just wanted to flag that even though we said the meeting is supposed to end at 15, we ask you to please stay on for 5 more minutes just so that we can wrap up quickly. So I am talking about finance. So finance represents the international, regional, and transnational financing from both public, private, but also alternative sources of funding that support climate mitigation and adaptation. Anyway, so it is based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and different capabilities. And so it is an important means of implementation for developing countries. And so under the climate change regime, climate financing is implemented through the financial mechanism, which was established by the convention, but also serves the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, and is made up of different funds and operating entities, such as some of those I pictured here. And so the Paris Agreement then also provided in Article 9 the different sort of provision of financial resources, and then importantly also provided for the development and the adoption of a new collective quantified goal, or NCQG, which was then adopted at COP29, and with 2 important sort of quantified goals: the 300 billion annually, and then also the scaling up of climate finance to at least $1.3 trillion by 2035. And so just a quick recap of what happened at COP30, and what was interesting, of course, was to see how much the NCQG would be mentioned, right, in the different decisions or the negotiations. And so under the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on the scope of Article 2.1c on the redirection of global finance flows towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development pathways, but also its complementarity to Article 9, which lays out the financial obligations also of the developed countries. There, it was interesting that they established the Veredas dialogue to continue exactly this dialogue on the complementarity of those two articles, and also a high-level roundtable. Then under the consideration of the two funds, so the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environmental Facility, there the COP and CMA basically asked those funds to take into consideration the relevant paragraphs of the NCQG. Similarly, about reporting, or Article 9.5, finance reporting, there as well was the information that would be included in the biennial communications were amended to include sort of the mobilization provision of finance that would implement the NCQG. And then similarly on the Standing Committee of Finance, it was also sort of the CMA requested that that committee also continue the preparation of work for the implementation review of the NCQG, and so on. And then interestingly, of course, also the Global Monserrat reiterated the two goals of the NCQG, but also it decided to convene a high-level ministerial roundtable to reflect on the implementation of the NCQG, and also established a 2-year work program on climate finance, including Article 9, Paragraph 1, on the obligation of developed states to provide financing to developing countries. And in March, or last month, or 2 months ago, sorry, the co-chair sort of asked for submissions of views on this work program. I think the deadline was end of April for that. Then quickly about what is on the agenda, the finance agenda for SB 64. As Pascale mentioned, the Adaptation Fund, but then also the first meeting of the Veredas dialogue will happen on June 9 and 10. And then also the second review of the function of the Standing Committee on Finance. So the Veredas dialogue, as I mentioned, is just the continuity, or is the continuity of the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue, but it will also take into consideration the safeguards that I mentioned in paragraph 3 of the decision, namely that were discussed heavily at COP30, because states wanted to make sure that the dialogue continues to be country-driven, and like protect the bottom-up nature of the Paris Agreement, etc. And then finally, also the review of the second review of the Standing Committee on Finance, which took some time, and it was actually deferred at COP30 to the SB 64. And so that's why we're looking forward to seeing the progress, and hopefully that they can make, or states can make, draft a conclusion and move on with that. Thank you. And now I think we're going to skip technology, I believe. And if you want to say some words about Article 6, Elizabeth, you would be welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Mara. Let me skip through to the slides. It'll just be a very quick couple of minutes for a high-level overview on Article 6. So as a really brief summary for those of you who aren't familiar, whilst the Paris Agreement NDC mitigation ambition cycle is individual for each member, each state, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement allows member states to collaborate and work together in their Paris Agreement commitments. So Article 6 covers both market, i.e. emissions, cap and trading systems, and also non-market, so just anything and everything in a collaborative forum that member states can work together. So this slide just lays out, I'll go through very quickly, a few of the sort of biggest outcomes from COP30 in the Article 6 space. So Article 6 negotiators, luckily, following many years of negotiating since the Paris Agreement was ratified, COP29 saw the finalization of all of the market rules, so covering Article 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8 and their various schemes. So COP30 focused more on procedural and some consolidation and improvement of the existing rules rather than having to go through negotiations to create new ones. So I'll just pick out a couple here. So Article 6.4, an interesting one, which shows the general trend of funds and modalities under the UNFCCC moving across to sit under the Paris Agreement and focus on implementation of the Paris Agreement rather than previous treaties. So the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism allows parties to fund mitigation efforts and carbon emission reductions programs in countries across the world. So it collects money which can then be used for other aims of the UNFCCC process. So interestingly, what used to be the clean development mechanism that sat under the Kyoto Protocol, that fund following the decision from COP30 is moving across to sit under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So this frees up millions that's currently sat in that fund, which will start contributing to the Adaptation Fund, which Pascale mentioned earlier. To pick up Article 6.8, non-market approaches, the Article 6.8 work programme was confirmed to be continuing, but coming up in SB 64, on to the next slide, will be considerations during those negotiations of how to improve the non-market approaches platform. Currently it's hosted by the UNFCCC and lists out all of the projects, initiatives, approaches that various parties can contribute to or get involved in. There are a lot of complaints about the system and sort of how clunky it is or how difficult it is to actually identify projects you might want to contribute to. So SB 64, specifically the SBSTA, will be considering the NMA platform technical paper that was released prior to COP30 with a view to recommending a draft decision for adoption at COP31. This should just be a general process of improving the platform. If you look at the decisions, there's lots of sort of very technical jargon of how exactly to improve online platforms and functionality, but in general just shows that there is a big focus on Article 6.8 and the potential that parties see in that. That was all I had on Article 6. I think I'm handing back to Pascale, if that's correct.
Thank you very much, Lizzie, for this whistle-stop tour of Article 6, and apologies to everyone that we slightly ran over our allocated time, but thank you very much to all of you for listening and attending this event. I'm afraid because we are out of time, we're not going to be able to take questions at this point. I don't see any questions in the chat, but just to clarify that this event has been recorded and the slides would be made available to participants. So yes, if you want to listen to it again or go through over the slide, and I realize we did go through some of them quite quickly, you'll have a chance to do that in your own time. Additionally, do feel free to reach out to us if you have got some question or things that we did not address during this session. We will be in Bonn in a few weeks' time, so feel free as well, and we hope to see some of you, many of you at that point as well. And I will leave it at that now. Finally, thanking again my colleagues, and special thanks to Alice and Lizzie, who also took the time out of their busy work schedule to prepare these materials and to present this session. Thanks very much to all of you, and you hopefully will see on the screen some information here about some materials that should help you prepare for the session. And last but not least, our Paris Agreement A to Z app, which you can download either on Google or the App Store, which will be updated to cover the COP30 decisions and is a very useful resources. And I can say that because I was not involved in drafting the last session, the last update. I will leave it at that. Thank you very much and have a good rest of your day and good weekend when it comes. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.